On the 20th of January, 1887, when the temperature on Silver Pine Ridge fell to 52 degrees below zero, and 73 souls would freeze to death across Madison County before the thaw, a 22-year-old Norwegian widow stood in her doorway wearing nothing but a thin wool dress. The man who had called her insane, the master builder who had told the whole settlement she was digging her own grave, stood before her with frost in his beard and his dying daughter in his arms. He fell to his knees in the snow. He looked at the warm yellow light spilling from her cabin onto the killing cold. And from his cracked lips came a single word ragged and broken as a prayer. How would I understand how we must go back? Back to the summer that lied. Back 8 months to a June morning in the Montana Territory when the air still whispered promises of endless warmth, and a young woman knelt beside a fresh grave on a hill of granite and pine and made a decision that would save her son's life and the lives of 14 others. A decision that would change the way men built homes across an entire territory for the next 100 years. Her name was Ingrid Halverson. She was 22 years old. She had buried her husband 6 months before, and she was about to do something that every reasonable man in 3 counties would call madness. The morning sun came soft through the lodgepole pines, the kind of light that makes a person forget what winter is. Ingrid stood at the edge of the small clearing where the wooden cross marked Anders. The cross was plain. She had carved his name herself with the blade of his old knife. The letters careful and even the way her grandmother had taught her to do letters back in Wisconsin when she was a girl. Anders Halverson, 1858 to 1885. Beloved. There was no room on the wood for the rest of what he was. Beside her, the dog sat very still. His name was Bjorn, the Norwegian word for bear, and Anders had given him to her on their wedding day 3 years before. He was part Norwegian elk hound, part something else from the Montana mountains with a thick gray-white coat and eyes the color of amber honey. He was 4 years old that summer, and he had not left her side since the morning Anders stopped breathing. Behind her, somewhere down by the creek, her boy was throwing pine cones into the water. She could hear the small splashes. Eirik was 7 years old. He had his father's dark hair and his father's quiet way of watching the world. Ingrid knelt and pressed her palm flat against the dark earth above her husband. She did not weep. She had finished weeping in November when she had held Anders through the last night of his life in the boarding house in Butte. He had been a silver miner. The lungs had taken him as they took so many of the men in those camps, not the cave-ins or the explosions, but the slow gray dust that turned a man's breath into stone. He had been 27 years old. He had coughed blood for 3 weeks before he finally lay still. His last words to her had been about a book. Ingrid, he had whispered, his hand trembling on hers. The book. Farmore's stories. The Jordus. It's not just stories. Look at the drawings. Farmor was the Norwegian word for grandmother on the father's side. Anders's grandmother Sigrid had come over from the Telemark Valley in Norway with nothing but a leather-bound journal and a head full of the old ways, the kind of knowledge that had kept families alive in mountain valleys for 1,000 winters. Anders had copied that journal in his own hand when he was a boy, page by page, while his grandmother dictated. After Anders died, Ingrid had taken what little money remained, the small homestead claim her husband had filed 2 years before the wagon, the dog, and her son. She had traveled west and south to the place Anders had chosen for them. Silver Pine Ridge in Madison County, 18 miles southwest of Virginia City, 5,400 feet above the sea. A south-facing slope of granite at the edge of the Tobacco Root Mountains. The cabin that came with the claim was a disaster. It had been built in 3 weeks by a man who never came back for the second winter. The logs were enormous lodgepole pine cut in haste, the chinking between them already crumbling in great mud and grass clumps. The fireplace at the eastern wall was a monument to bad ideas. A yawning stone mouth nearly 5 feet across with a chimney that drew the heat straight up into the open sky and pulled freezing air in through every gap in the cabin walls. Anders, if he had lived to see it, would have laughed at it. Then he would have torn it down. But Anders had not lived. And so Ingrid pressed her palm against the grave one last time, and she stood, and she walked back to the cabin with Bjorn padding silent at her heel. She had 8 months, maybe less. She had read the almanacs. She had listened to the talk in Virginia City when she passed through. She had watched the way the old men looked at the sky lately and said nothing. The grasshoppers had come in plagues that spring. The river bottoms had run high. The cattle on the open range were already thinner than they should have been, and it was only June. The bones of the land were whispering that something was coming. Something the new ranchers did not understand. Inside the cabin, she put a kettle on the small iron stove she had brought from Wisconsin. Eric came in with his pockets full of small stones he had found in the creek. He laid them on the table in a careful row sorted by color. "Mama," he said. "When are we starting?" Ingrid looked at him. He had not asked what they were starting. He had only watched her all that long ride west while she sketched on scraps of paper at every campfire. He had watched her measure the back wall of the cabin against the slope of the granite hill. He had not asked, because he trusted her the way Anders had trusted her, the way her grandmother had trusted her grandfather to know which way the storm was moving. That trust was the heaviest thing she carried. "Soon," she said. "First I have to find your father's book." She knelt and pulled the cedar trunk from beneath the bed. The hinges were old and complaining. Inside, beneath 2 folded shirts and the small bundle of letters she had not yet been able to burn, lay the journal. It was a thick, leather-bound thing, the cover dark and oiled from years of handling the pages, thin and crowded with Anders's neat handwriting and his careful pencil sketches. She set it on the table and turned the pages slowly. There were drawings of barn joints, of well sweeps of the way to set a stone foundation against frost heave. And then, near the back, there were the drawings she needed. Roykoven med jordkanaler, smoke oven with earth channels, a small, tight firebox, a long, horizontal flue running into a hillside, a vertical chimney rising at the far end, arrows showing the path of the hot gases, numbers written in the margins, angles, distances, materials. At the top of the page in her husband's hand were 3 words in Norwegian underlined twice. Jorden glemmer ik. The earth does not forget. Ingrid sat for a long time with her hand flat upon that page. Outside, the wind moved through the lodgepole pines with a sound like distant water. Bjorn lay against her feet. Eirik watched her from the table, his small face grave. She was not a fool. She was not a frontier wife who knew nothing but bread and laundry. She had been raised in a small Norwegian community in northern Wisconsin, in a house where her grandmother had baked flatbread on a soapstone hearth her grandfather had built with his own hands. She had carried lamp oil down into root cellars at 30 below zero and felt the stunning calm of the deep earth. She knew in her bones that her husband's grandmother had been right. She knew the principles were sound. She would have to build it alone. With a 7-year-old boy and a dog and her own 2 hands. She would have 8 months and a town full of men who would call her mad. So be it. The next morning, she walked the 3 miles into Silverpine settlement to buy nails. Silverpine was 47 households strung along a single muddy street that ran between the tobacco root foothills and the river. There was a Methodist church with a white steeple at the north end, a general store and post office in the middle, a livery, a saloon, and a small bank at the south end with its name painted in fresh gold lettering on the window. Vance & Sons Savings. The "and Sons" was an exaggeration. Cornelius Vance had no sons. He had only ambition. The general store was owned by Mr. and Mrs. Whitaker. Mr. Whitaker was a quiet man who weighed flour. Mrs. Whitaker was not quiet. Her name was Prudence, and she was 45 years old, and her tongue had ruined more reputations in Madison County than any drought or flood. She stood behind the counter that morning with her arms folded and her eyes already busy. "Mrs. Halverson," she said. The name came out of her mouth like a coin she was reluctant to spend. "Back so soon. I need a pound of cut nails," Ingrid said. "6 penny." Mrs. Whitaker moved slowly toward the nail bin. She raised her voice just slightly, just enough that the 2 women near the dry goods could hear. "Poor Norwegian thing," she said ostensibly to her husband. Up there all alone with the boy. The grief has cracked her mind, I think. She was measuring the back of her cabin last week, with a knotted string, in the rain. Ingrid did not answer. She placed her coins on the counter. She took her nails. She walked out into the sun. On the wooden boardwalk in front of the store, a girl was waiting. She was perhaps 19 years old, small and brown-haired, with a face that had learned how to hide what it was thinking. Her name was Willa Greer. Ingrid had seen her in church the first Sunday. She had not spoken to her. "Mrs. Halverson," the girl said quietly. She glanced behind her at the store window. "I wanted to say, my grandmother was from Bergen. She used to talk about the old houses, the ones with the channels." Ingrid stopped. Willa lowered her voice further. "I think what you're doing is brave." She did not wait for an answer. She turned and walked quickly down the boardwalk the way a person walks when she's being watched. Ingrid stood there a long moment holding her small paper packet of nails, and for the first time since November, she felt something that was almost not loneliness. She started down the boardwalk toward the wagon. That was when she saw the men gathered at the corner. There were 6 of them in shirt sleeves and suspenders drinking from tin cups. At their feet lay a great pile of cut cordwood gleaming pale and fresh. In the middle of them stood a man with iron gray hair, a thick gray beard, and the easy stance of a man who had been right about most things for most of his life. He was 52 years old. His name was Thaddeus Cobb, and he had been the master builder of Silverpine for the last 30 years. He had built 19 of the 47 houses in town. He had buried 21 men who had frozen in homes other people had built badly. He saw Ingrid. He raised his tin cup in something that was almost but not quite a greeting. "Mrs. Halverson," he said. "A word if I may." The other men quieted. "I rode out past your place yesterday," Cobb said. His voice was kind. That was the worst part. "Saw your wood pile. 2 cords, maybe. By my count, ma'am, you'll need 12 before November. Maybe 15, the way the geese are flying south early." Ingrid waited. "I want to be plain," he said. "There's no shame in asking for help. My boys and I, we can drop and split 8 cords for you in 2 days. The town would want that. It's what neighbors do." She inclined her head. "Thank you, Mr. Cobb. So you'll let us?" "No." The silence that followed was not a polite silence. Cobb's face did not change, but something behind his eyes went still. The men around him looked at one another. "I don't follow you, ma'am. I'm building a different kind of hearth," Ingrid said. "I won't need 12 cords. I'll need 3, perhaps less." One of the younger men laughed. Cobb did not. He looked at her a long moment, and then he set his tin cup down on the barrel beside him with great care, the way a man sets down something he does not want to break. "Mrs. Halverson," he said, "I have built houses in this country for 30 years. I have seen women try to economize on fuel before. I have seen what comes of it. With respect, ma'am, what kind of hearth—" "You will see." She did not say it with any defiance. She said it the way one says good morning. Then she turned and walked to her wagon. Bjorn rose from beneath it and fell in beside her. She loaded the nails and the small sack of dry beans, and she climbed up onto the seat, and she clicked her tongue at the mule, and she drove out of Silverpine at a steady pace with the eyes of half the town upon her back. Behind her, Thaddeus Cobb watched her go. He scratched his beard. He picked up his tin cup again. "That girl," he said softly to no one in particular, "is digging her own coffin." He did not yet know that he had spoken the sentence that would haunt him for the rest of his life. That evening, after Eric was asleep and Bjorn was stretched long and quiet by the dying stove, Ingrid sat at the table with the journal and a fresh sheet of paper. She drew her plan in clean, careful lines. The firebox, 4 feet high, 2 feet wide, lined with soapstone set against the eastern wall of the cabin where the old fireplace stood. The horizontal flue, 38 feet long, 30 inches wide, 36 inches tall, lined with creek stone angled 3 degrees upward, 3 degrees no more, no less. Her husband's careful pencil note in the margin had been firm on this to allow the lazy heated air to climb. The vertical chimney, 19 feet tall, 14 inches in diameter, emerging from the granite slope on the far side of the hill where no neighbor would see it. She set down the pencil. She thought of Anders lying in his Butte boarding house, his hand around hers, his voice already going thin. The earth remembers warmth. She thought of her grandmother Sigrid in Wisconsin, of the smell of bread on the soapstone, of the way the snow piled against the small north windows and could not get in. She blew out the lamp. In the morning, she began to dig. The first stones of the old fireplace came down hard. She had borrowed a heavy iron pry bar from the livery in town, and she worked it into the mortar joints with all the weight of her small body. Eric carried the smaller stones aside in a wooden bucket, his thin arms straining his face serious. Bjorn lay just outside the door and watched his ears up, his amber eyes following every movement. By the end of the first day, her hands were bleeding through the rough leather gloves Anders had left behind. The gloves were too big for her. She wrapped strips of cloth around her palms beneath them and kept working. By the end of the first week, the entire old hearth was down. She had a pile of stones outside the cabin door that came up to her waist. The gaping wound in the eastern wall opened directly onto the slope of granite at the back of the cabin. The earth there was cool and dark and smelled like the inside of a deep well. Bjorn sniffed at it and made a low sound in his throat that was not a growl, but something older and more curious. He could smell what she could smell. He could smell the stone remembering the sun. It was on the 8th day that the engineer came. Ingrid heard the wagon coming up the rough track, and she straightened from the hole and wiped the dirt from her face with the back of her wrist. 2 men climbed down. One was Thaddeus Cobb. The other was a stranger, tall, thin, in a dark wool suit unsuited to the country with a silver pocket watch chain, and the careful, narrow eyes of a man who had been to many universities. "Mrs. Halverson," Cobb said. His voice was no longer kind. "This is Dr. Reginald Pemberton. He is a mining engineer. Yale College class of '63. Mr. Vance at the bank asked him to come up and assess your work." Dr. Pemberton bowed slightly. He looked at the hole in the wall of the cabin. He looked at the woman dirt-streaked in her husband's old shirt with the sleeves rolled to the elbows. He looked at the pile of stones. His eyes moved over everything with the quick, neutral cataloging of an instrument. "Madam," he said. His voice was kind in the way a doctor is kind to a patient who is not going to recover. "I do not wish to alarm you, but basic thermodynamics disagrees with what I am told you intend to construct. Hot smoke rises. It rises quickly and it rises vertically. If you compel it to travel 38 feet horizontally before allowing it to rise, it will stall. It will cool below the temperature of efficient flow. It will reverse. The first time you light a fire in the structure, you describe this cabin will fill with smoke within 90 seconds. You and the boy will suffocate in your beds. I cannot in conscience permit you to proceed without telling you this plainly." Ingrid stood very still. Bjorn had moved up to her side. He did not growl. He simply stood beside her with his great gray head level with her hip, watching the strangers. "My husband's grandmother lived in a house with such a flue," Ingrid said quietly. "She lived to be 91. She raised 7 children in it. Her village in Norway is still standing." "Madam," said Dr. Pemberton, "I do not doubt the existence of folk traditions. I doubt their applicability to the climate of Montana." "Then watch," Ingrid said. "You will see." Cobb and Pemberton exchanged a look. Pemberton drew from his coat a small leather notebook. He wrote in it for perhaps 2 minutes, his pencil moving fast. He tore out the page. He handed it to Cobb without a word. Cobb tipped his hat to Ingrid, and the 2 men got back into the wagon and drove away. That afternoon, when Ingrid rode in for more nails, she saw the page tacked to the front window of the Whitaker General Store. It was signed by Dr. Reginald Pemberton, Engineering Sciences, Yale College. It bore the official-looking seal of his own personal stationery. The top of the page read in heavy underlined letters, "Official Assessment. Halverson Structure. unsafe for habitation, danger to occupants. Below it, in smaller print, was a paragraph explaining the impossibility of horizontal flue draft and warning the citizens of Silver Pine that the widow Halverson and her son were in mortal danger of asphyxiation in their own home. A small crowd had gathered to read it. Ingrid walked past them. She bought her nails. She walked back to her wagon. She did not look at the notice on the window, but Bjorn did. He had ridden in beside her on the wagon seat. When she came back, he was standing on the boardwalk staring at the open door of the bank across the street. Inside the bank's doorway, his hand on the doorframe watching her, stood a thick-set man in a black broadcloth coat. His name was Cornelius Vance. He was 45 years old, and he had not yet been to her cabin in person, but he had been waiting for her. Bjorn, who almost never growled at strangers, was growling now. A low rumbling sound from deep in his chest. Cornelius Vance smiled at Ingrid across the muddy street. He raised his hat to her in a small, mocking gesture. Then he stepped back inside the bank and closed the door. Ingrid felt cold along her spine, and the sun was very warm. She climbed onto the wagon. She turned the mule for home. As they passed out of the settlement, she saw something at the side of the road that had not been there that morning. A figure stood at the edge of the lodgepole pines, perhaps 30 yards off. Tall, lean, with long black hair braided down his back, dressed in a dark woolen coat that did not quite belong to any settlement. An older man, 60 perhaps, though it was hard to tell. He did not move. He simply watched as her wagon passed. Bjorn's ears went up. But he did not growl. That was the strange thing. Bjorn looked at the man at the tree line for a long moment, and then he looked back at the road, and he lay down on the wagon seat. Calm. Ingrid did not understand. Not yet. That night she dreamed of her grandmother Sigrid baking flatbread on a warm soapstone hearth in a small wooden house in Wisconsin, while outside the snow piled higher than the windows. In the dream, her grandmother turned to her and said in Norwegian, "Du ikke alene, jenta mi." You are not alone, my girl. The earth has not forgotten, and neither have those who remember the earth. In the morning, on the threshold of her cabin door, where Bjorn had slept the night through, lay a stone hand axe of polished black basalt, the kind a crow craftsman might have made 100 years before. Beside it, weighed down by the axe, was a folded piece of birch bark. She unfolded it. It was a drawing. A simple, beautiful drawing in charcoal and earth lodge, the kind the Crow and the Lakota had built for centuries on these high plains, with a wooden frame and an earth-covered dome, and a long horizontal smoke channel emerging from the back. Below the drawing, in a careful, untaught English hand, were 5 words. Earth has long memory. Friend. She knelt on the threshold and held the birch bark in her hands, and wept for the first time since the morning of her husband's funeral. Bjorn pressed his great head against her shoulder. It was June the 28th, 1886. 6 months and 23 days remained until the cold would come for them all. That evening, 2 riders came up the rough track to her cabin. One was Cornelius Vance. The other was a man she did not know in a town suit carrying a leather portfolio. Vance climbed down from his horse and did not remove his hat. "Mrs. Halverson," he said. His voice was cordial. "I'll come to the point. This claim is rough country. A widow with a small child has no business out here alone. I'd like to make you an offer." He nodded to the man with the portfolio, who produced a paper. $200, cash, today, for the claim and the cabin. You and the boy can take the stage east. There's good Norwegian country in Minnesota. Family there, perhaps. $200. The claim was worth at least $800. Probably more. Ingrid did not speak. She stepped forward and took the paper from the man's hand. She looked at it carefully. Then she tore it slowly down the middle. Then again. Then again. She handed the 4 pieces back to the man very politely. Cornelius Vance's face did not change. It only got very still the way a frozen pond gets still. "I will come back in the spring, Mrs. Halverson," he said softly. "When the snow has gone and the sheriff is with me. The state takes orphan boys, you understand. Better Minnesota with $200 than Madison County with nothing." He tipped his hat. He climbed onto his horse. He rode away. Bjorn watched him go. Bjorn did not growl this time. He simply watched, and his amber eyes held something that was not animal at all. It was something far older than that. Ingrid stood in her doorway with the 4 pieces of the torn contract in her hand, and the sun was setting red and gold beyond the Tobacco Root Mountains, and her son was inside reading by the lamp, and she understood perfectly and finally that she had no choice now but to finish what she had begun, because there was no road back to Wisconsin and no road forward except through the granite hill at the back of her cabin. And here I want to ask you something. If you were Ingrid, 22 years old alone with a small boy, $200 offered to you that could carry you to safer country and a whole town telling you were mad, would you have taken the money? Would you have run? Or would you have stayed and dug Stay With Me? Because what happens next will surprise you. She walked back into the cabin. She closed the door. She picked up her pry bar. In the morning, she began to dig the tunnel. The tunnel began as a darkness in the back wall of the cabin no larger than the mouth of an oven. Ingrid dug it by lantern light on her hands and knees with a short-handled pick and a flat coal shovel that had once been her husband's. The first 3 feet went easily. The granite of the hill was not solid stone, but a long apron of weathered, scree-packed earth and loose rock that gave way beneath the pick if she was patient with it. After 3 feet, the work became harder. She set herself a rhythm. 2 hours of digging. Half an hour of carrying out the bucket. Half an hour of shoring the roof with cut lengths of lodgepole pine 8 inches thick set vertically every 2 feet, and braced with horizontal crosspieces the way Anders had drawn it in the journal, the way the Norwegian miners had braced their tunnels for 400 years. Then 2 hours of digging again. Eirik became her partner. He was 7 years old. He sat at the mouth of the tunnel with his father's pocket watch open beside him, and every 2 hours he called to her in his clear, small voice. "Mama, it's time." She would crawl out blinking into the daylight. He would have water ready. Sometimes he had soaked a strip of bread in milk and put it on a tin plate for her. He never complained. He never asked her to stop. Once in the second week, he asked her something else. "Mama," he said, watching her drink the water. "Will we be all right? Will the cold take us too?" She set down the cup. She knelt in front of him and put her dirty hand against his cheek. "The earth remembers warmth, my love," she said. "It does not forget, and we will not forget either." He nodded. He did not ask again. Bjorn began bringing her things. Small things. A pine cone. A stick. Once a dead field mouse which he laid at the mouth of the tunnel with great seriousness as a man might lay a wreath. Ingrid laughed for the first time in many months. She thanked him gravely. He thumped his great tail against the dirt. The tunnel grew at the rate of about 18 inches a day. Some days more, some days less. By the middle of July, she was 8 feet in. That was when the man with the long black braid came out of the trees. She was kneeling at the mouth of the tunnel sorting stones when his shadow fell across her. She did not start. Bjorn was lying beside her, and Bjorn had not moved. She knew before she even looked up that whoever stood behind her was no enemy. She turned slowly. He was perhaps 60 years old. His face was deeply lined the color of cured tobacco, and his eyes were black and amused. He wore a dark wool coat too heavy for the season, and at his belt hung a leather pouch decorated with red and white quillwork. In his arms he carried a roll of something soft and gray. "Mrs. Halverson," he said. His English was careful, slow, and clear. "My name is Henry Walkingstone. My grandmother was Crow. My grandfather was a Norwegian trapper out of Fort Benton. I have been watching your work." He set the bundle gently on the ground. He unrolled it. Inside lay a coil of bison hair washed and combed, and 3 pale lumps of clay wrapped in a clean cloth. "This clay," he said, "comes from a place near Bear Paw. It is good clay. My grandmother's people used it to line the smoke holes of the earth lodges. It does not crack when the fire is hot. The hair you mix in, it binds, it holds. Your grandmother in Norway would have used reindeer hair, perhaps. Here we use this." Ingrid stared at him. Her throat closed for a moment. "Why?" she said. He smiled. His teeth were very white against the brown of his face. "My grandfather's grandfather built houses inside hills," he said. "The white man forgot what the red man remembered. Your grandfather's grandfather built houses inside hills too in your country across the sea. The earth is older than all of us, Mrs. Halverson. It is good when those who remember help each other. That is the rule." She put down the stone she had been holding. She held out her hand to him. He took it. His palm was as hard as oak bark. That afternoon, Henry Walkingstone showed her how to mix the clay with the bison hair and a little water, and a small amount of fine wood ash, and how to work it into the joints of the stone tunnel lining so that the heat would not crack the seams. He showed her how to lay the floor stones at a careful 3-degree slope. He showed her how to test the slope with a small ball of clay. If the ball rolled, the slope was wrong. If the ball stayed and slowly settled, the slope was right. He did not stay for supper. He shook her hand again and walked back into the trees. Bjorn watched him go and lay down with his head on his paws, content. He came back twice a week. He never knocked. He simply appeared at the mouth of the tunnel in the morning with another bundle of clay or a roll of bison hair, or once a small bundle of dry sage that he laid on the threshold of the cabin and said only, "For the corners, so the work is clean." He never accepted payment. He drank water from her tin cup. He never came inside. The town began to notice. By the end of July, Mrs. Whitaker had a new piece of gossip. The Norwegian widow was consorting with an Indian. The Norwegian widow was being visited by a savage. The Norwegian widow was perhaps summoning something out of the hill. By the first Sunday of August, the Reverend Ezekiel Crow, a tall, gaunt man of 55 with hair the color of iron filings and a voice like a small bell tolling, stood in his Methodist pulpit and chose his text very carefully. It was from Isaiah. About those who dig deep to hide their counsel from the Lord. About those who say in darkness, "Who seeth us?" He did not name Ingrid Halverson by name. He did not have to. He spoke of those who consorted with the pagans of the plains. He spoke of those who would build downward toward the dwelling place of demons rather than upward toward the throne of God. Ingrid sat in the back pew with Eric. She heard every word. She kept her hands folded in her lap and her face still, and when the sermon was over, she stood with the rest, and she sang the closing hymn in her clear soprano voice, and she walked out into the August sun without looking at anyone. But there was a young man at the back of the church she had not seen before. He was perhaps 28 years old, with dark hair, a clean-shaven face, and the soft black coat of a junior clergyman. He was the new assistant minister just arrived from Boston by way of the Methodist Seminary. His name was Caleb Brookmeyer. He had been listening to the sermon with his eyes on the wooden floorboards and a small, tight line between his brows. As Ingrid passed him in the aisle, he raised his eyes once and they met hers, and in that single half-second she saw that he did not believe what Reverend Crow had said, and that he was sorry for her, and that he was ashamed. She did not stop. She walked on. 3 days later, just at sunset, Caleb Brookmeyer rode up to her cabin alone. He did not dismount. He held out a book to her across the fence rail. It was a thick book bound in dark green cloth with gold lettering on the spine. Thermodynamics and the Movement of Heated Gases, 1879. The Yale University Press. "Mrs. Halverson," he said quietly, "Reverend Crow does not know I am here, but I have read this book. Page 47, ma'am. The behavior of heated gases in long horizontal passages of varying angle. Dr. Pemberton, I think, did not read the whole volume. He pressed it into her hands. He nodded once. He turned his horse and rode back to town in the gold light of the dying day. Ingrid stood at her fence with the heavy book in her arms. She walked back to the cabin. She sat at the table by the lamp. She read page 47, and she found in the careful equations and the cool prose the precise mathematical proof that her husband's grandmother had been right and Dr. Reginald Pemberton of Yale had been wrong. The behavior of heated gases over a horizontal flue of 3 degrees positive slope at a length not exceeding 50 feet, with a terminal vertical chimney of at least 15 feet, was not only possible, it was by certain measures more efficient than vertical exhaust. She put her face in her hands and laughed. It was the first time in 7 months. Bjorn pressed his head against her knee. Eric stirred in his sleep behind the curtain. The next night, someone threw a stone through her window. It came in the dark just after she had blown out the lamp. The glass shattered with a sound like the breaking of ice. Eric cried out. Bjorn was at the door in a single bound, hackles up a sound coming from his throat she had never heard him make before, low and grinding. She lit the lamp with shaking hands. Eric had a thin cut on his small forearm from a flying piece of glass. She bound it with a clean strip of cloth and held him against her until his crying stopped. Then she let Bjorn out. He was gone 20 minutes. When he came back, he carried something in his mouth. He laid it on the cabin floor at her feet very gently, the way he laid the pine cones and the dead mouse. It was a small, torn piece of blue flannel shirt with a button still attached. The button was made of carved bone. She knew that button. She had seen it on the shirt of Cornelius Vance's 18-year-old nephew. The boy was named Royal. He helped his uncle at the bank. She did not go to the sheriff. There was no point. The sheriff was Cornelius Vance's brother-in-law. She put the piece of flannel in a tin box on the mantel. She nailed a piece of oiled paper over the broken window. She picked up her pick the next morning and she went back into the tunnel. She was 12 feet in. She still had 26 feet to go. By the middle of August, she was 20 feet in. The work had taken on a slow, almost dreamlike rhythm. She rose before dawn. She drank coffee. She crawled into the tunnel. She came out at noon to feed Eric. She crawled back in. She came out at sunset. She washed in the creek. She read by lamplight from the Yale book and her husband's journal. She slept 4 hours, sometimes 5, and rose again. Old May Sutter came up the track on her bony gray mule one morning in the 3rd week. May was 68, German by birth, Bavarian to be precise, and her late husband had been the blacksmith of Silverpine. She had buried him 3 winters back. She climbed off her mule with effort and stood looking at the cabin and the small wagon and the pile of dirt outside the tunnel with her clear, pale eyes. "My grandfather built one," she said in her thick accent. "In Bavaria, outside the village of Mittenwald. They called him crazy, too. He outlived them all. He lived to be 97 and his house is still standing. My cousin writes me letters from it." She handed Ingrid a small brown paper packet. Inside were dried apple slices, a wedge of hard yellow cheese, and a tightly rolled drawing on yellowed paper almost 100 years old of an Erdkeller and earth cellar with the precise dimensions and angles written in faded German script. "You keep it," said May. "It belonged to my grandfather. He doesn't need it anymore. You do." She climbed back on her mule and rode away without another word. Ingrid pressed the drawing flat in the pages of her husband's journal, where it has remained to this day. You who are listening now, take a moment with this. Imagine her 22 years old in a torn dress with bleeding hands, 12 feet inside a hole in a granite hill, with her 7-year-old boy keeping time outside, and a town 3 miles away that has decided she is mad. Imagine the courage of the choice to keep digging. And ask yourself this: who in your life has been called mad, when really they were the only one telling the truth? Tell me in the comments. I want to know. The crisis came in the 4th week of August. She had reached the 27th foot. She was 11 feet from where the vertical shaft would begin to rise. Henry Walkingstone had spent the morning with her helping set the stones of the lining. He had gone home at noon. Eirik was asleep, exhausted in the cabin. Bjorn lay across the threshold of the tunnel mouth as he always did, his ears pricked. She drove her pick into the wall at the far end of the tunnel, and the wall gave way. It did not collapse. It opened. Behind it lay a thin seam of dark, wet sand, and through that sand in a low, cold murmur came a small underground stream she had not known was there. Water poured into the tunnel around her knees in a steady, cold flood. For 1 second she stood frozen. The work of 2 months, the shoring, the lining, the careful 3-degree slope. If the tunnel filled, the timbers would soften, the stones would settle, the roof would come down. Her son would have no winter shelter. She did not scream. She turned and crawled out as fast as she could, water sluicing past her, and she shouted for Henry. She did not know how. She did not know if he could hear. But she went out to the trees at the edge of the clearing where he had first appeared, and she stood there in her wet skirts, and she called his name. Eirik came out frightened in his nightshirt. Bjorn ran in tight, worried circles. Ingrid told Eirik to stay in the cabin. She ran back to the tunnel. She began to bail. Her tin water bucket, then a kitchen pot, then both. It was hopeless. The water came in steady. She could not bail it faster than it filled. Henry came over the ridge an hour before sunset at a run. She did not know how he had known. She has never asked him in all the years that followed, and he has never said. But he came. He had with him 3 things: a bundle of hollow river cane lengths, each about 2 feet long, a small leather pouch of a coarser clay, and a wide, flat-bladed shovel. He went into the tunnel without speaking. He felt along the wet wall. He found the source of the seep. He cut a side channel in the wall at a downward angle, the depth of his hand 2 feet long, leading out toward the hillside. He fitted the cane pipes together end to end and packed the clay around them. He drove the pipe through the side channel and out the far end into the open air of the hillside, where it emerged dripping among the lodgepole pines. The water followed the pipe. It left the tunnel. It ran down the slope into the brush. The tunnel floor began to dry. She sat in the mud beside him, shaking. "My grandmother's people," Henry said quietly, "knew the bones of this country, Mrs. Halverson, where the water hides, where the heat hides. They knew because they listened. White men came and stopped listening." He wiped the clay off his hands. "You listen. That is why you are here." He stayed for supper that night for the first time. He sat at the table with Eirik and Bjorn and Ingrid, and they ate beans and cornbread, and he did not say much. But when he left, Bjorn followed him out to the trees and stood watching him go with an expression Ingrid could only describe as respect. The repair cost her 9 days. Their food was running low. The tunnel was now 29 feet in. She kept digging. By the middle of September, she had become sick. She had been working too long in the cold damp of the tunnel without changing her clothes. Her fever rose to 104. She lay in her bed for 4 days, unable to stand. Her chest rattled when she breathed. She remembered Anders. She thought with strange calm that perhaps the lungs took the Halverson wives as well as the Halverson men. Eirik, who was 7, fed her broth with a spoon. He boiled water on the stove. He climbed onto the chair to reach the salt jar. Bjorn slept on the floor beside her bed and would not move. On the 2nd day, old May Sutter came up the track again. She had walked the 3 miles this time, leading her mule, because the mule could not be hurried. She sat with Ingrid for 2 days and 1 night. She fed her sage tea and broth and made cool cloths for her forehead. She read to Eirik from the Bible by the lamp. On the 3rd day, Willa Greer came. She had walked 4 miles. She brought eggs in her apron. She had told her father she was going to the post office. She would be beaten for this, Ingrid knew, but Willa came anyway. She sat beside the bed and brushed Ingrid's hair out of her face. "Mrs. Halverson," Willa whispered. "John Hawking told my father I am to marry him in November. He is 43. I am 19. I am to take care of his 3 children. Her voice broke. He has buried 2 wives already, Mrs. Halverson. Both of them froze. Ingrid took the girl's hand. Her own hand was hot and shaking. Willa, she said, when you have nowhere to go, you come here. Do you understand me? You come here. There will be room. Willa wept silently. She kissed Ingrid's burning forehead. She left at sundown. On the 4th night, Ingrid dreamed. She dreamed she was in the tunnel by lantern light alone. Anders stood at the far end. He did not speak. He simply looked at her, and then he pointed at the small notebook in her hand, and then he was gone. She woke at dawn. Her fever had broken. She was weak as a kitten, but she was clear. She got up. She drank water. She lit the lamp at her table. She opened the journal to page 23. Page 23. The page on the angle of the horizontal flue. She read what her husband had copied from his grandmother in the careful black ink of his patient hand. Husk 3 grader oppover ikke 0. Det forskellen mellem liv og død. Remember 3 degrees upward, not 0. That is the difference between life and death. She rose. She went out to the tunnel. She crawled into it with her grandfather's old carpenter's level, the wooden one with the small green glass bubble. She laid it on the stones at the floor. The bubble sat perfectly centered, 0 degrees. She had laid the floor perfectly flat. She had not noticed her error. Her measurement string in the dim lantern light had slipped, and she had set the floor true horizontal, not 3 degrees up. If she had lit the fire as it was, the gases would have stalled. The smoke would have backed up. She and Eric would have died in the cabin, just as Dr. Pemberton had predicted, just as Thaddeus Cobb had warned. Pemberton would have been right. Cobb would have been right. Anders's grandmother had spent her life telling the difference between the right way and the way that killed you, and she had laid the floor wrong by 1 small fraction, and her husband had walked through her fever dream and pointed at the page that saved them. She and Henry took 6 days to lift every stone of the floor and reset it 1 careful inch at a time at 3 degrees of rise, the angle of the lazy upward climb of warm air. When they were done, she dropped a small ball of clay at the firebox end. It rolled slowly, gently, the entire 38 feet to the vertical shaft. She watched it go, and she leaned against the cold stone, and she wept again. The vertical chimney went up at the back of the hill in the 2nd week of October. Henry helped her with the heaviest stones. The shaft rose 19 feet from the granite slope, almost invisible from the cabin below, hidden among the rocks. They capped it with a small cone of stone to keep out the snow. On the 31st of October, the day she had set for herself, she sealed the old vertical chimney above the cabin. She filled it with stone and packed it with the clay Henry had brought her. The cabin no longer had a chimney to the sky. The cabin had only the small, tight firebox in the eastern wall, and the long road of stone under the hill, and the secret chimney at the back of the slope. She had made her covenant with the earth. She laid the first fire that evening at 5:30 o'clock. She used dry pine kindling and a single small split log of seasoned cottonwood. She struck the match. Eirik stood beside her, his hand in hers. Bjorn sat at the threshold of the tunnel mouth, watching with the patience of a 1,000-year-old animal. For the first 90 seconds, the smoke rolled backward. It curled out of the firebox door into the room. Eirik began to cough. Ingrid stood absolutely still. She had read the Yale book. She had walked through her fever. She knew what was about to happen. At minute 3, the fire reached its temperature. The hot gases inside the firebox grew light. The column of air in the long horizontal flue, warmed in turn, began to creep forward, lazy climbing lifted by the 3 degrees of slope, reaching for the cooler 19-foot vertical chimney at the far end of the hill. At minute 4, the draft caught. It was the softest sound Ingrid had ever heard. A long, low, sighing pull, almost like breath. The smoke in the firebox turned. It stopped curling outward. It began to flow inward into the tunnel drawn by the small, invisible engine she and Henry and Anders and Sigrid and 1,000 years of forgotten Norwegian and Crow grandmothers had built into the bones of the granite hill. The cabin filled with clean air. The fire burned small and fierce in its soapstone box. Eirik stopped coughing. He stared. Ingrid sat down on the floor with her back to the eastern wall, and Bjorn came and lay across her legs, and within 15 minutes she could feel through the soles of her bare feet the very first faint warmth begin to seep up from the floorboards. Within 2 hours, the back wall of the cabin, the wall of granite that pressed against the hill, was 72 degrees. The floor was 68. The air was clear. The fire had consumed only one small log. Eirik took off his shoes. He sat down on the warm floor and laid out his wooden soldiers in a long line, and Bjorn slept beside him with his great head on his paws. It was the 31st of October, 1886. Outside, the first hard frost lay on the lodgepole pines. 2 days later, Thaddeus Cobb rode by Ingrid's cabin on his way back from a job at the Wilson place. He glanced up at the old chimney out of habit and slowed his horse. No smoke? Nothing. He looked at the cabin. He saw the soft yellow lamplight in the windows. He saw a small movement inside a woman, a boy, a dog. He saw warmth. But the chimney was cold. He could not explain it. He sat his horse for a long time at the edge of the road. Pride is a great builder of walls. Pride told him there had to be a trick. Pride told him she was burning small, hiding her work, putting on a brave face. Pride told him to ride on. He rode on. He did not see the thin curl of clean blue smoke that rose from the back of the granite hill far behind the cabin, almost invisible among the rocks. The next day, the telegraph from Virginia City brought a single piece of news which Mrs. Whitaker read aloud to a crowded general store in tones of solemn relish. A Pacific weather observation. An Arctic air mass of immense size was building over the Yukon and the Canadian plains. The Weather Bureau in Helena projected its movement south within 6 to 8 weeks. The dispatch ended with one line. This will be the winter of a generation. Make your preparations now. Cornelius Vance read the bulletin in the bank. He folded it carefully. He placed it in the top drawer of his desk. He smiled. Now pause for a moment with me. Take a breath. Ingrid has done it. Against everything, against everyone, the system works. The fire breathes. The hill gives back its warmth. The boy plays barefoot on the boards. And in the bank in Silver Pine, the man who wants her dead is smiling. If you were Cornelius Vance, if you had the bank, the sheriff and the family, the whole town behind you, would you ride out and warn her? Would you save her knowing your bargain was over? Or would you wait for the cold to do your work? Be honest with me. Tell me in the comments. Because the cold was coming. And it was going to be worse than anything any of them had ever seen. The first snow came on the 11th of November and never melted. By the 20th, the drifts were 3 feet deep along the north walls. The cattle on the open range began to die in numbers no one had seen in a generation. By December, ranchers were finding entire herds frozen on their feet, 200 and 300 head at a time in the lee of hills, where they had taken shelter from the wind. Old men in town began to say the word, die up. It was a word from the Texas cattle country. It meant the season in which everything that was not under a roof simply died. None of them had used it about Montana before. Ingrid laid a single small fire each morning and a second small fire each evening. 90 minutes of burn. 4 split logs a day. The granite wall in her cabin held its warmth as steady as the heart of the hill itself. The floor stayed warm beneath the children's bare feet. The air stayed sweet and still. Eirik did his lessons at the table. Bjorn slept by the eastern wall. Outside, the world began the slow drop into something none of them had ever lived through. By the 8th of January, the temperature at noon was 8 below. By the 11th, it was 22 below. On the morning of the 14th, old May Sutter, sitting alone in her small cabin in town, noticed that the brass barometer her husband had brought from Bavaria had fallen in the night by more than 8/10 of an inch. She put on her coat. She walked across the frozen street to the general store. She said to Mrs. Whitaker in her thick old voice, "Der blaue Tod kommt. The Blue Death is coming. In my village in 1828 it came like this. 83 people died." Mrs. Whitaker laughed at her. Old May went home. She filled every lamp. She brought in every stick of her woodpile. She closed her shutters and waited. The Arctic mass crossed the border that night. By dawn on the 15th, it was 38 below zero. By dawn on the 17th, it was 46 below. The wind came up from the northwest at 67 miles an hour, and it did not stop for 9 days. The world turned a strange pale color, neither blue nor white, but something between them the color of cold light through a thick pane of old glass. The settlers who survived would always call it the blue stillness. The wind howled, and the trees in the forests around Silver Pine began to explode where their sap froze and split the wood sounds like rifle shots in the long blue dark. Cattle that had survived the first storms now died standing up. A man who walked from his house to his barn without a rope might never be found. The first to die was John Hawking. John Hawking, age 43, who had been engaged to marry Willa Greer in 3 weeks. He went out on the morning of the 17th to look for 2 cows that had not come up to the barn. He went without a rope. He went without telling anyone. They found him 40 feet from his back door when the storm broke. He had been turned around in the white. He had walked the wrong direction. Willa Greer in her father's house in town heard the news and went up to her room and did not come down for 2 days. And when she came down, her face was strange and quiet and almost peaceful. She did not have to marry him. The cold had freed her. The cold had freed her, but it was killing everyone else. By the morning of the 19th, 41 people had died in Madison County. By the 20th, 56. The Whitaker General Store had run out of coffee lamp oil and salt pork. Cornelius Vance's grand 4-story house, the largest in Silver Pine with its 11 windows and its 3 chimneys, was bleeding heat through every joint. His wife had lost feeling in 2 toes. He had ordered her to put on more stockings. He sat in his study with a small whiskey and waited for spring. Thaddeus Cobb's house was not as grand as Vance's, but it was the soundest in town. He had built it with his own hands 23 years before. It had 2 stone chimneys and a deep cellar and double-thickness walls. By the 18th, his woodpile was 3/4 gone. By the 20th, he had burned the back porch. He had burned a spare bed frame. He had burned the kitchen chairs. His youngest daughter, Lucille, was 8 years old. She lay on a mattress dragged close to the great fireplace in the front room, wrapped in every blanket the family owned beneath 3 of her father's wool coats. Her temperature was 103. Her breath came shallow and fast. Her small fingers were the color of skim milk. Her mother, Eleanor, sat beside her and would not stop weeping. Cobb stood in his kitchen at 10:30 in the evening on the 20th of January, looking out the frosted glass at the dark, and he did the arithmetic. He had perhaps half a cord of wood left. Half a cord would not last the night. He thought of the Halverson claim. He thought of the widow who he was certain was dead with her boy frozen in the bed beside her. He thought of her woodpile, which he had seen in the summer small but real 3 cords worth perhaps, and dry. He hated himself for what he was about to do. But the choice was Lucille. He put on his coat. He put on his second coat over the first. He put on his hat and his scarf and his mittens. He took his lantern. He took his rope. He told Eleanor he would be back before midnight. He stepped out into the blue stillness. The cold hit him like a hand of iron across the face. 49 below. The air burned in his lungs. The snow squeaked underfoot, that dry, false squeak that means the cold has reached the place where snow no longer behaves like snow. He tied his rope to the doorpost. He walked north into the wind, into the dark. The distance from his house to Ingrid Halverson's cabin was by his reckoning a little under a mile. He had walked it many times in summer. In the blue stillness, it took him 55 minutes. He stumbled the last 100 yards. His beard had frozen solid to his scarf. His feet were beyond pain. He could not feel his fingers. He came over the small rise above the cabin clearing and he stopped. Yellow light. Soft yellow light in the windows. He thought his eyes were playing tricks. He thought it was a lantern someone had left burning in an empty house. He pressed forward through the drifts. There was no smoke from the cabin chimney. No smoke at all. He could see that even in the dark. He reached the door. He raised his frozen hand. He hammered upon the wood. He heard inside the soft scrape of a wooden bar being lifted. The door opened. He saw first the dog. The great gray dog sat just inside the door on warm pine floorboards, perfectly calm, his amber eyes fixed on Cobb. He did not growl. He simply looked. Then he saw the woman. She was wearing a wool dress with a soft brown apron. Her hair was loose down her back. She wore no shawl. She wore no coat. She looked at him without surprise. Behind her on the warm floor, her boy was lying on his stomach with his row of carved wooden soldiers. He was in his shirt sleeves. He looked up at Cobb with mild interest, the way a child looks up from a game when a visitor comes for tea. And then the heat came out of the cabin. It came out around Ingrid Halvorsen like a tide. A soft, even pervasive warmth, the kind of warmth that does not press but only enfolds. It rolled over Cobb's frozen face and into his frozen beard, and his eyes filled instantly with the hot water of melting frost so that he could not see clearly. He took one step inside. He took another. The door closed behind him. He stood in the middle of the room. He looked for the fire. There was no fire. There was only a small soapstone firebox in the eastern wall with a bed of red coals no larger than a dinner plate. And yet the room around him was warm. He took off his frozen mitten. He stretched out his hand slowly to the back wall of the cabin, the wall of stacked granite that pressed against the hill. He touched it. It was warm. He let his hand stay there. The stone gave back its heat to him, steady and patient and ancient. He sank slowly to one knee. He pressed his other hand flat to the pine floorboards. They, too, gave back the slow heat of summer remembered. He looked up at Ingrid Halvorsen. She had not moved. She watched him with no triumph at all. There was only a deep, weary kindness in her face, the kind that does not need to win because it is already understood. The words came out of his cracked mouth without his planning them. How? She opened her mouth to answer, and the second knock came at the door. Bjorn rose. He gave two short, soft barks announcement, not alarm. Ingrid opened the door. Willa Greer stood there in her dead fiancé's overcoat, carrying her small sister Lily in her arms. The little girl was 5 years old. Her lips were blue. Behind Willa stood old May Sutter leaning on a cane. Behind old May stood 3 other women from the settlement: Mrs. Henderson with her infant son, Mrs. Pelham with her 2 little girls, Mrs. Tate alone with her hands wrapped in rags. And at the back of the small, ragged column, last hunched into a torn shawl, holding her 10-year-old grandson against her chest, stood Prudence Whitaker. They had walked all of them through 49 below zero, 3 miles from the settlement. They had walked because old May Sutter had remembered her grandfather in Bavaria, and because she had been pounding on doors since sundown, saying the same sentence over and over. If anyone is alive on this side of the hill tonight, it is the Norwegian girl. Come with me, bring your children, come. They had followed her. They had no other choice. The fires had failed. The houses were dying. Prudence Whitaker fell to her knees on Ingrid's threshold. Her grandson clung to her neck. I called you mad, she whispered. I told the whole town, forgive me, forgive me. Take the boy, take him, I beg you. Ingrid bent. She took the small grandson into her own arms. She lifted Prudence Whitaker to her feet with one strong hand, and she pulled her into the warmth. Come in, she said, all of you. There is room. There is always room. They came in. 14 people in a one-room cabin built for 2. The women laid the children on the warm floor in a careful row against the warm granite wall. Bjorn moved among them like a great gentle nurse, sniffing each child, settling against the smallest one, Lily Greer, as if he understood that her need was greatest. Cobb was still on his knees by the wall. Ingrid turned to him. Her face was calm. "Mr. Cobb," she said, "where is Lucille?" He could not speak. His daughter. He had come for wood. He had not come for her. He had left his daughter dying at his own cold fireplace. "Mr. Cobb," Ingrid said again very gently, "go and get her. Bring her here. Bring Eleanor. Bring your other children. We have room." He stood. The frozen tears slid down his face into his beard. He went out into the blue stillness. He ran with the rope still tied to his belt back along the line of his footprints. He had never run in cold like that before. His lungs felt as though they were filled with knife blades. He came back 40 minutes later, carrying Lucille in his arms with Eleanor and the older two children stumbling behind him. He gave the child to Ingrid. Ingrid laid her on the warm floor against Bjorn's great gray side. Within an hour, Lucille's color began to return. Within 2, her breathing eased. Within 3, she opened her eyes and looked at the great dog beside her, and she whispered, "Mama, may I touch the dog?" It was the first thing she had said in 6 hours. Eleanor Cobb began to weep silently. She did not stop for a long time. At midnight, there was another knock at the door. Henry Walkingstone stood in the snow carrying an armful of split pine and a folded bison robe, and behind him, a small, worn leather pack of dried meat. He stepped into the cabin without speaking. He laid the wood by the firebox. He laid the bison robe over the sleeping children. He took off his hat. Ingrid took him by the hand and led him to the table and pulled out a chair. And Henry Walkingstone, 60 years old, half Crow, half Norwegian, sat at a white woman's table inside a white woman's cabin for the first time in his life. He ate stew from a tin bowl. He did not speak. His eyes shone. At 1 o'clock in the morning, a fourth knock. The Reverend Caleb Brookmeyer, his face white with cold, with the elderly Reverend Ezekiel Crow leaning on his arm. Crow had refused at first. Then, in the dark, alone in his parsonage with his fire going out, he had thought of his sermon about Isaiah, and he had bent his head and he had said to Caleb, "Take me to her. I must ask her to forgive me." Caleb let him in. Crow stood inside the door with his hat in his trembling old hands. He looked at the women and the children on the warm floor. He looked at Henry at the table. He looked at Ingrid. "Mrs. Halverson," he said. His voice broke. "I spoke against you. From God's pulpit. In God's house. I called the work of your hands the work of darkness. She crossed the room. She put her hand against his cold cheek the way a daughter might to a father. "Sit by the wall, Reverend," she said. "It is warm. Sit by the wall." He sank down onto the gentle floorboards with his back against the breathing stone of the hill, and he wept. Caleb knelt beside him and held him. Outside, the wind tore at the lodgepole pines. There were 18 people in the cabin that night. The fire in the soapstone box burned low and steady on 4 small logs. The walls gave back their heat as patiently as stones in the sun give back the day. The floor cradled the sleeping children. The air was sweet and still. I want you to imagine it. 18 souls, 8 of them children, crammed shoulder to shoulder against a wall of stone that had no right to be warm in a cabin with no chimney rising to the sky on the coldest night in 50 years, while 73 other souls in the same county were freezing to death in houses built by men who had laughed at the Norwegian widow. Imagine it. Sit with it. That is the picture I want you to keep. Sometime near dawn, Thaddeus Cobb crossed the room. He sat down on the warm floor next to Ingrid. He was 53 years old, but in that hour he looked older than that. His hands were old and scarred from a lifetime of building. "I have built houses in this country for 30 years, Mrs. Halverson," he said. His voice was low and rough. I have buried 21 men who froze in homes I built with my own hands. I called you a fool. I called you mad. While you were building the only thing in this county that could save my daughter, I was telling everyone in Silver Pine that you were digging your grave." He looked at the soapstone firebox. "Every house I have ever built, ma'am," he said, "taught the cold how to get in. You built one that taught the earth to give the warmth back." He paused. He swallowed. "I am 53 years old, and I am your apprentice now if you will have me." She put her hand over his. She did not speak. She did not have to. The wind began to die just after sunrise on the 22nd of January. By noon, it had fallen to 20 miles an hour. By evening, it had stopped altogether, and a heavy gray silence settled over Madison County. The silence after great violence. The sheriff riding through Silver Pine on the morning of the 23rd found Cornelius Vance frozen at his own bank desk. The fire in the bank stove had gone out sometime in the night of the 21st. Vance had not gone home. He had stayed at the bank because he had been counting the deeds and bonds in his safe by lamplight, calculating which homesteads in the spring would default. In his stiff right hand, he held a single document half-folded. It was the original draft of the sale offer he had once handed to Ingrid Halverson. The $200 offer. She had torn the duplicate. Vance had kept the original on his desk. He had been planning perhaps to amend it. He had been thinking of her at the very end. His widow Margaret, who had survived in the kitchen by the iron stove, came to Ingrid's cabin 3 days after the thaw. She brought with her the entire deed to the Halverson claim and a small folded paper she would not let Ingrid open until she had gone. It was the deed to 40 additional acres of bottom land along Beaver Creek, signed over to Ingrid in Margaret Vance's careful hand. There was no note. None was needed. By the end of February, the death count for Madison County stood at 73. 41 men, 26 women, 6 children. The territorial newspaper called it the worst winter in the recorded history of the Montana Plains. Across the open range, 90% of the cattle were dead. The great cattle empires of the territory broke that winter and never recovered, and the era of the open range ended in a single season. But in Silver Pine, no one else died after the night of the 20th, because by the night of the 21st, Ingrid Halverson's cabin had taken in 23 people in 3 shifts, and old May Sutter and Henry Walking Stone had organized a steady caravan of the warmest blankets, and the last of the food, and the warm granite hill behind the Halverson cabin had held its temperature through the worst night of cold the Montana Territory had ever known. Dr. Reginald Pemberton, the engineer from Yale, returned in the second week of March. He came alone, without escort, on a hired horse. He stood in the doorway of Ingrid Halverson's cabin with his hat in his hand and his face the color of paper. "Madam," he said, "I have come to ask if I may measure your structure." She let him in. He measured it for 2 days. He took the temperatures at the firebox, at the floor, at the granite wall, at the mouth of the long flue, at the secret chimney on the hill. He measured the rate of fuel consumption. He compared it to the standard fireplaces he had certified in Helena, in Bozeman, in Virginia City. He sat at her table on the second night with his calculations spread before him and his silver pocket watch ticking and his face very still. "Mrs. Halverson," he said at last, "I owe you an apology. Your structure is approximately 8.4 times more thermally efficient than the best conventional masonry fireplace currently in use in this territory. I am wrong. I have been wrong. With your permission, I should like to publish a paper on what you have built." He bowed deeply the way a Yale man bows. The paper appeared in the Engineering News Record in the autumn of 1887. Its title was "The Halverson Hearth, a Study in Norwegian Adapted Thermal Mass, Heating Madison County, Montana Territory." Pemberton named her in it. He named Henry Walking Stone in it. He included a hand-drawn cross-section of the tunnel. The paper was read in Boston and in London and in Christiania, the capital of Norway, where an old woman of 93, the last living daughter of Anders's grandmother Sigrid, wept when her grandson read it aloud to her by the fire. By the spring of 1888-14, Halverson hearths had been built across Madison County with Thaddeus Cobb and Ingrid Halverson working side by side free of charge in every cabin. Cobb had become her foreman. He never built a conventional chimney again. Willa Greer, who had not married John Hocking, became Ingrid's full apprentice. By 1890, she was designing improvements, a heated stone bench set along the floor of the tunnel that held warmth for 18 hours after the fire went out. She married Caleb Brookmeyer in 1891. They had 3 children. Their cabin had a Halverson hearth, and Willa never had a chimney either. Old May Sutter lived to see 23 Halverson homes built before she died in her sleep in the spring of 1891 at the age of 73. Ingrid was at her bedside. So was Henry Walkingstone. She was buried in the small cemetery in Silver Pine. On her stone, by her own request, was carved a single word in German, Erinnerung, remembrance. Henry Walkingstone returned to his people in the Crow Country in 1889, but he came back to Ingrid's cabin every spring for the rest of his life. He died in 1904. He is buried in the Crow Country with the bison robe Ingrid sewed for him folded under his head. Reverend Ezekiel Crow lived only 2 more winters. He preached from his pulpit on the first Sunday after the Great Thaw a sermon on the parable of the wise virgins who kept oil in their lamps. He named Ingrid Halverson by name. He asked the congregation to forgive him by forgiving her. He stepped down from the pulpit and he never preached against her again. Caleb Brookmeyer became the senior minister. Thaddeus Cobb lived another 26 years. He built 91 more houses in Madison County, every one of them with a Halverson hearth. He outlived 2 of his own children. He buried his wife Eleanor in 1909. Lucille, the daughter he had carried to Ingrid's cabin that night in the blue stillness, grew up. She trained as a nurse in Bozeman. She came home in 1913, married a rancher, raised 4 children of her own. She lived to be 93 years old. Bjorn lived to be 16. He died in 1898 on a soft summer afternoon in the patch of sun outside the cabin door he had loved best. He had grown white in the muzzle. He had grown slow. Ingrid sat beside him for the last hour with her hand on his great gray head, and she told him in Norwegian what a good boy he had always been. They buried him beneath the lodgepole pines at the head of the slope in sight of Anders's grave. She carved his name into a flat stone with her own hands. Just the one word, Bjorn. A little later, when Eirik, who was no longer Eirik the 7-year-old boy, but Eirik Halverson, civil engineer, age 44, employed by the Northern Pacific Railroad, came home in 1923 to visit his mother. They walked together up the slope above the cabin to those 2 stones. The grave of Anders, the grave of Bjorn. Ingrid was 59 years old. Her hair had silvered. Her hands were old and strong. She knelt at her husband's grave. Eric watched her place a small stone on top of the cross. The stone had come from the floor of her firebox. It was still warm to the touch. "Mama," said Eric, "do you ever think how strange it is that you change the way men build all over this country? They study you at the university now, Mr. Pemberton's grandsons. They study you." Ingrid smiled. She brushed pine needles off Anders's cross. "Mitt kjære barn," she said softly. "I did not change anything. I only listened to your father, and to his grandmother, and to old May, and to Henry, and to the hill. The hill was always saying the same thing. It says it still. We only forgot how to hear it." He helped her up. They walked down the slope together. A young dog, gray, amber-eyed, the grandson of Bjorn, through Henry Walkingstone's son's line, ran ahead of them toward the cabin, his tail high. In 1978, 92 years after Ingrid Halverson began her tunnel, a team of researchers from Montana State University excavated the original Halverson cabin, which had been preserved as a Madison County historical site since 1942. They measured the tunnel. They measured the firebox. They measured the granite mass behind the eastern wall. They lit a small fire in the original soapstone box. Within 90 seconds, the draft caught. Within 2 hours, the granite wall stood at 72 degrees, the floor at 68. The fuel consumption was so low, their lead engineer thought his instruments had failed. They recalibrated and tried again. The instruments were not failing. The hearth, 92 years old, abandoned for 40 years, was burning at 11.2 times the efficiency of a conventional fireplace. The paper that followed in 1982 was titled Forgotten Engineering: The Halverson Hearth of Madison County and the Recovery of Pre-Industrial Thermal Mass Design. It noted that the principles of Ingrid Halverson's design were the same principles being independently rediscovered in late 20th century passive solar architecture. It noted that the same principles were used at the Amundsen Scott South Pole Station. It noted that an unschooled 22-year-old Norwegian widow working in a granite hillside in Montana in 1886 had built by hand alone a structure that modern thermodynamic engineering could not have improved upon by more than 4%. The cabin still stands today. You can visit it. There's a small bronze plaque outside the door. It reads, "The Halverson Cabin. Ingrid Halverson, 1864 to 1944. Jordan Glemmer Ika." Ingrid Halvorsen died on the 3rd of April 1944 at the age of 80. She died in her own bed in her own cabin with her son Arik beside her and her grandson, and the great-great-grandson of Bjorn lying at her feet. The warmth of the granite wall behind her bed held steady against the spring chill outside. There had been 3 feet of snow that morning, and the soapstone firebox held only a small fire, and her last words were spoken in Norwegian to a husband she had not seen in 59 years. "Anders," she said. "Jeg kommer, Jordan Husker. I am coming. The hill remembers." And so I will leave you here, my friends. With this thought, the world told Ingrid Halvorsen to build a bigger fire. She built a smarter one. The world told her to fight the cold. She listened to the cold instead and asked it where it lived and made a covenant with it. The world told her she was mad. The hill told her she was right. What forgotten wisdom is your family carrying that the world has dismissed? What did your grandmother know? Your grandfather? Your great-aunt who lived alone in the hills and would never explain how she did things? Some of you listening to me now are sitting in houses built by men who have forgotten how to listen to the bones of the land. Some of you are the only ones in your family who still remember. Some of you are Ingrid. Comment below and tell me. Tell me your grandmother's name. Tell me what she knew. Because the old knowledge does not die unless we let it die. And while you are still here to remember, it lives. Thank you for sitting with me through this story. Light a small fire tonight if you can. Sit by it. Listen. The old wisdom is still down there in the granite, in the clay, in the long, warm road under the hill. It is only waiting to be remembered. Good night and stay warm.